It's certainly fun to drive around the Rockies, admiring them from the highway. But if you really want to fully experience these mountains, you need to leave the car behind and get out and walk. Here are some teenagers hiking near Exshaw Pass in the Front Ranges west of Calgary in 1976. They were on the second day of a 10-day adventure with Sia and me. Here was our camp that evening, right at the tree line. What a place to spend the night! Hike any higher than that, and you might wind up on the summit of a mountain, like this guy overlooking Jasper, way down there. You can tell he's a naturalist. He's got a notebook and a beard. If you're a rock climber, like Sia and me, here's a pleasant way to spend an afternoon. Here we are, climbing a 1,000-foot slab in Jasper's Moline Valley. Or you could be way up on Castle Mountain, the peak I showed you earlier. This is what it's like to climb the wall of the castle. A friend of mine and I had just finished a neighboring route on the cliff. We strolled along the flat top of the mountain in time to see our friends doing their last pitch. I know, I'll bet these photos seem scary to those of you who haven't done any rock climbing. But see that rope? It makes all the difference. Without it, you're dead if you fall off. With it, if you fall, the rope catches you. You're suddenly a bit lower on the cliff, but unharmed and ready to try that hard move again. We each have our own way of expressing the pleasure of reaching the top. Here's my friend Eckhart Grassman doing just that. I once asked Eckhart why he stood on his head on top of every mountain he climbed. He thought for a moment, upside down there, and then he said, in his lovely Swiss-German accent, "Well, someone has to do it." He's also a mathematician, which might be relevant. Once you've enjoyed the top of a peak, you have to go back down, right? This part is usually a knee grinder, especially at my age, but some peaks have these long slopes of rock fragments called scree. Scree is surprisingly soft underfoot. You can run down, taking big leaps. It's a blast. Just don't get going too fast. Scree is sharp stuff. All the climbing I've shown you thus far is on rock, steep rock. But in the Canadian Rockies, we also have steep ice. That's what these people are climbing, glacial ice. How can they ascend that extremely slippery slope? Well, they do it with an ice axe in each hand and spikes called crampons on their boots. Crampon is a French term, but it works in English too because it describes what you get on your lower leg when you're not used to front pointing up a pitch like that. You get a cramp on. Even in summer, the upper parts of the higher peaks in the Canadian Rockies remain snowy. It's another world up there. I have loved it well. Especially this peak, the highest of all. Mount Robson. If you drive 100 kilometers west of Jasper along Highway 16 on a clear summer day, Mount Robson can be seen looking just like this. That's the summit elevation above sea level, 3,954 meters, which for Americans in the audience is 12,972 feet. Either way, it's the highest peak in the Canadian Rockies. That's not as high as summit elevations in the Colorado Rockies. Just west of the city of Colorado Springs, where I grew up, lies Pike's Peak, elevation 4,302 meters, over 300 meters higher than Mount Robson. But the elevation gain, which is to say the vertical distance from base to top, is another matter. The elevation gain of Pike's Peak is 2,470 meters above Colorado Springs, and it's the greatest rise found anywhere in the American Rockies. However, that's 500 meters less than the elevation gain on Mount Robson. The summit of Mount Robson is nearly 3 kilometers above its base, It's the tallest peak, not the highest peak, but by far the tallest peak, found anywhere in the Rockies, Canadian or American. That elevation gain comes all at once, too. Robson is really steep. From the base to the summit, the straight line distance is only 3.6 kilometers. Not so Pike's Peak. It's 15 kilometers from the base to the top instead of 3.6 kilometers, a much longer and gentler slope. Thus, Pike's Peak is not nearly as impressive. There is a road right to the summit. There is a railway up this mountain. It's a cog railway, like they have in Switzerland. Now, in this photo, both the highway and the railway are out of view. But you can imagine what it's like to be up there on a busy day in July. The flat summit is taken up mainly with a parking lot, and it can be full. On such a day in 1966, Sia and I climbed Pikes Peak with two of our friends, Billy Davidson and Jim Kazir. We went up the steepest side of the mountain, the one to the right in the shadow. It's a proper mountaineering ascent, not a hike. As we reached the top and were coiling the ropes, a middle-aged fellow walked over to us. He looked down the cliff, sucked in his breath, and quickly stepped back. Then he saw Sia's braids hanging below the brim of her helmet. His eyes widened. A female climber? For a moment he was at a loss for words. And then he said, in a Texas accent, "Where are y'all climbing to?" Jim Kazir replied, "We're going on up," he said, with a straight face. Remember, we were standing on the summit. "Good, good," the man said, turning and walking back to his car. Well, the air was thin up there. There's no railway, no highway on Mount Robson. There's not even a trail to the top, which is always covered with snow and ice. It's a far more difficult mountain than Pikes Peak. But you can climb it with me right now. Here's the usual route up the east side. I have climbed it from the other side, too, the one you see from the highway. But this is the classic approach, the way a young mountain guide from Austria led two members of the Alpine Club of Canada to the top in 1913. That was the first ascent. The guide was Conrad Kane. He's on the left there, with Albert McCarthy and William Foster, just after completing the climb. McCarthy was an American ranching in southeastern BC. He was best known later on for leading the first ascent of Mount Logan, Canada's highest peak. Foster was the BC Deputy Minister of Public Works. Foster was with McCarthy on the ascent of Logan, too. Conrad Kane didn't have those big black dots in the snow to follow way back then, or that circle on the mountain to tell you where to pitch your tent, like we do today. Well, okay, not really. But I have been 5 times on Mount Robson and made the summit twice. That's considered to be a pretty good score. Considering the nature of this climb, it's little wonder that it wasn't done until the 20th century. People look at that photo and they wonder what would happen if one of the climbers slipped off that narrow ridge and started to fall down the side. What would the other climber have to do? Well, jump off the other side, of course. The rope between them would run across the crest and catch them both. No, that's not what we do these days. These days, we have something we can stick into the snow and will hold all 3 of us if we fall off. It's a piece of aluminum the size of a dinner plate. You sit in the snow facing the direction the pull will come from if a fall occurs, and you push the fluke into the snow behind you as deeply as you can. That's what you call it, a snow fluke. It has a short cable attached to it. You clip yourself onto that cable, which makes a precise angle with the fluke. Any force applied to the fluke just pulls it deeper into the snow. I took the previous picture of my 2 friends coming toward me as I took in the rope, safely anchored to a snow fluke. If one of them had fallen off, taken the other one with him, the fluke would have held all 3 of us. Back to our climb. Past the narrow ridge, I am approaching a couple of climbers' tents on the part of Robson called the Dome, elevation about 3,000 meters. It's the usual place to camp when you're following Conrad Kane's route up the peak. When we arrived, the temperature had dropped below freezing, even though it was August the 8th. Our boots crunched in the snow. The other climbers in the tents heard us coming, and as we walked up, out came a mug of hot buttered rum. Such is the camaraderie among mountaineers. Soon we were sitting in their tent with them, discussing the attempt on the summit we were all about to make the next day. Here is what we were planning to climb. That slope of ice on the right, it's about 400 meters high. 400 meters is just a number. To give you an idea of the size of the ice face, I've put a circle around some tents at that same camping spot. When Conrad Kane took his 2 clients up the ice face in 1913, crampons didn't have front points like they do now. You used your ice axe to chop steps in the ice, and you stood on them sideways. It must have taken Kane several hours to hack his way up that slope. The other 2 climbers were roped to him. They had to wait patiently before each step up. Well, nowadays, we just kick our front points into the ice and ascend much more quickly. Here is a set of crampons like the ones I used to climb Robson. You can see the front points sticking out to the right. When you're climbing ice, they make all the difference. But despite the superior gear we have these days, Robson is still a serious climb. I remember looking out the door of our tent as the day ended, wondering what would happen tomorrow. Or what might happen tonight if those thunderheads came over here. Way up on the dome, there was no place to hide from the lightning. Luckily, the storms moved on. The next morning dawned clear. The only cloud was the cloud of snow blowing off Robson's summit. We were good to go. My climbing partner that day was Greg Spohr, with whom I enjoyed some memorable ascents in the 1970s. On Robson, we both had cameras. Greg took this photo of me starting up the Cane face just as the sun lit it up. Again, we were lucky. Most of the steep ice was covered with snow. Of course, that snow could slide off while we were on it, always a worry. But this late in the summer, an avalanche was unlikely. We kept climbing. The snow wasn't solid enough to hold our boots, so we needed to use the front points of our crampons for grip in the glacial ice under the snow. But the snow did help to support our feet, making the climbing easier than it would have been if the ice had been bare. Which it did become. Never mind, Greg and I were experienced at this sort of thing. We were fit and strong. We kept climbing. And not long after that, we reached the southeast ridge of the peak. The Cane face is on the left side of it. The climbing was easier along that ridge, but we had to be careful not to walk out on the cornices you see forming scallops along the edge. Each cornice was nothing but snow that had been built out from the crest by the wind blowing up the slope on the right side. Cornices are quite dangerous, and it's hard to tell when you're walking on one. We stayed well to the right of the ridge crest. An hour later, we could see the summit ahead. Some of the other climbers who had camped with us had started earlier than we did. They had reached the top and were on their way back down the peak. We gave each of them a congratulatory handshake. Then it was our turn to stand on top of the highest mountain in the Canadian Rockies, and as you now know, also by far the tallest. That peak in the background is Whitehorn Mountain, and it's about the same height as the peaks around Lake Louise. It's dwarfed by Mount Robson. Greg took this photo of me on the summit. On my chest, you can see one of the snow flukes we were using. Greg had the other. Below the snow fluke, there's an ice screw hanging from a carabiner. We used ice screws as anchors in the bare part of the ice face. Then I pointed my camera at Greg, and while I was messing with it, the clouds suddenly rolled in. We waited, but they hung around until we had to start down, and I never did get a good photo of Greg on the summit. This one would have to do. He has never forgiven me.